The loan papers sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Keisha signed them. She kept walking past them. Making coffee, walking past. Cooking dinner, walking past. Coming home from a double shift at the restaurant. Setting her keys on the counter, looking at the papers, and going to bed. She wasn't afraid of the numbers. She'd been reading financial documents since she was 19 years old, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in Decatur while the old woman showed her exactly what a balance sheet meant and why nobody who looked like them could afford to be confused about money. She wasn't afraid of the loan. She was afraid of what signing it meant. Not for the business, for the marriage. Because once you put your name next to someone's on a legal document and hand it to a bank, you are telling that bank something you cannot take back. You are saying, whatever he does, I am responsible. Whatever he builds or destroys or walks away from, I will be here when you come looking. She signed on a Thursday morning. Terrence kissed her on the cheek and drove downtown to the attorney's office. She went back to her own restaurant and worked the lunch service. That was the first mistake. Not the signing, the believing. But before we get to the reckoning, before we get to the night in that ballroom in Midtown Atlanta when everything Keisha had carried for 7 years came into the light, let me take you back to where this story really starts. Hi, and welcome to Her Drama Tales. Do me a favor by subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a moment of the drama. Because what Keisha built while nobody was watching was about to become the most expensive lesson a man ever learned in this city. Keisha Dupree grew up in Decatur, Georgia, the kind of neighborhood where everybody knew everybody and Sunday dinner was a non-negotiable. Her grandmother, a woman named Viola, had run a catering operation out of her home kitchen for 30 years. Not a business with a license, not a restaurant with a sign on the door. A kitchen that fed 300 people at weddings and funerals and church anniversaries because Viola Dupree understood something about food that most people never figure out. Food is not about hunger. It's about belonging. Keisha learned that at 12 years old, watching her grandmother cook for a family that had just buried their father and couldn't bring themselves to be in a room without the smell of something warm coming from a kitchen. She watched the way people's shoulders came down when the food arrived. The way grief moved over slightly to make room for something else. She understood it then, and she never forgot it. By 24, she had a culinary certificate, 3 years of line cook experience, and a vision for a restaurant that would do what her grandmother's kitchen had always done: make people feel like they belonged somewhere. She spent 2 years saving. Every dollar, every shift, every tip. She opened Ember at 26 in a small space on Glenwood Avenue in East Atlanta. Farm to table, southern-rooted, accessible without being cheap. 40 seats. A chalkboard menu that changed with the seasons. The first year nearly killed her. The second year, she broke even. The third year, people started talking about it the way Atlanta talks about places it has decided to love. Ember was real. It was working. And Keisha had built it alone. She met Terrence at a jazz bar in Midtown on a Thursday night, 2 years after Ember opened. He was handsome in a way that filled the room. Tall, sharp dresser. The kind of man who spoke about the future like he already lived there. He worked in commercial real estate. He had ideas about everything. He was exciting in the way that some men are exciting before you understand that excitement and reliability are two very different things. They dated for 8 months. Got engaged. Married the following spring at a rooftop venue in Buckhead with 200 people watching. Keisha wore a gown her grandmother helped her pick out, and Viola sat in the front row and said nothing except, when Keisha walked past her on the way to the altar, "Keep your own accounts, baby." Keisha laughed. She thought it was a joke. The first year of marriage was good. The second year was fine. The third year was when Terrence came into the kitchen one evening and said he had a vision. A lounge. Not a restaurant, something different. A high-end lounge in Midtown with a craft cocktail program. Live music Thursdays through Saturdays. The kind of space where Atlanta's new money came to be seen and where the deal-making happened after midnight. He had already scouted a location. A converted warehouse space on Peachtree. He had projected the numbers. He needed $250,000. He needed Keisha to co-sign. "Your credit is better than mine right now," he said. "And the bank knows you've already run a successful business. With your name on it, we get the rate we need." Keisha looked at her husband. She looked at the fire in his eyes. The same fire she'd felt when she'd cashed out her retirement account to open Ember. She believed in that fire. She'd built her whole life on the idea that vision plus work equals something real. "Okay," she said. The loan came through in 3 weeks. $250,000, with both their names on the documents. Keisha's credit. Keisha's assets listed as collateral. Keisha's business history as the evidence that made the bank say yes. The lounge opened 4 months later on a Friday night. It was beautiful, chrome and deep mahogany, a bar that stretched the full length of the building, lighting that made everyone look like they were worth something. Keisha went to the opening, stood by the entrance and watched Atlanta come through the door, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like a partner. That feeling lasted about 6 months. By month 7, the projections weren't holding. Terrence had changed the concept twice, first shifting from a lounge atmosphere to a nightclub model, then trying to pull it back when the wrong crowd started coming in. The vendors weren't being paid on schedule. The manager he'd hired had quit. Keisha started seeing the shape of failure forming in the numbers, the way you can see a storm in the sky before it actually arrives. She asked him about it directly one Sunday morning. "The loan payment comes out the first of every month," she said. "That's coming from our joint account. Terrence, if the business isn't generating enough to cover it." "I know what the payment is," he said. "I need to know if we're behind." "We're not behind." "Then why is the vendor invoices folder empty on the shared drive?" He looked at her the way you look at someone who has just done something rude. "You went through my business files? They're on a drive we both have access to." "I wasn't going through anything." He left the room. She sat at the table and looked at her coffee going cold, and understood something she hadn't let herself understand yet. The business wasn't the problem. She was the problem. She'd become inconvenient. The woman who kept asking questions, who knew where the ledgers were, who understood the difference between what he was saying and what the numbers were showing. 3 months after that conversation, Terrence told her he was leaving. He said it in the kitchen. He said something about growing apart, about needing space, about how she was so focused on work that she'd stopped seeing him. He said it with the careful language of a man who has rehearsed his lines, and Keisha sat very still and listened to every word. Then she asked one question. "The loan," she said. "What happens to the loan?" He told her the lawyer would sort it out, that the business would generate enough to cover it, that she had nothing to worry about. She knew right then that she had everything to worry about. The lounge closed 8 months after Terrence left. Terrence moved out of their house and into an apartment in Midtown. The loan did not close. The loan remained. $250,000 at a fixed rate, monthly payment of $4,800. Both names still on the documents, Keisha's credit still attached to every dollar. She called the bank. The bank was not interested in her personal situation. She called a lawyer. The lawyer told her what she already knew. She had co-signed. She was liable. Whatever Terrence paid or didn't pay, whatever he did with the business or what remained of it, her name was on that note, and her name would stay there until the note was paid. She found out about Simone on a Wednesday evening in October. She'd gone back to the house, still technically hers, still in the middle of the divorce settlement, to retrieve some kitchen equipment she needed for Ember's new catering operation. There was a car in the driveway she didn't recognize. She sat in her own car for a moment, her hands perfectly still on the wheel, and then she backed out and left. She went back to the restaurant. She put on an apron. She worked the dinner service until midnight. And somewhere between the third and fourth course going out to table 7, something settled in her chest. Not peace, something harder than peace. Something that doesn't have a gentle name. Purpose. Keisha paid the loan. Every month. For $1,800, leaving her account on the first. Regular as a bill. Steady as a punishment she had decided to survive. She didn't take a vacation for 2 years. She didn't buy anything she didn't need. She drove a car that was 6 years old and needed new brakes, and she fixed the brakes herself at a shop in Decatur, where the owner had known her grandmother. She wore the same 4 pairs of shoes until one of the cooks at Ember quietly pointed out that the left one was coming apart at the sole, and she laughed because she hadn't noticed. What she did instead of spending was work, but differently than before. Not the anxious working of someone trying to keep something from collapsing. The focused working of someone who has decided to build something that can never be taken. She studied Ember the way you study something you're going to take apart and rebuild completely. She followed the inventory daily. She tracked the cost of every plate against the price of every menu item. She found the inefficiencies, the vendor she was overpaying for linen, the scheduling pattern that was costing her 30 hours of unnecessary overtime a week, the dessert menu that was selling poorly enough to be replaced entirely. She fired the dessert menu and brought in a pastry consultant who changed everything. She renegotiated the produce contract. She stayed after closing 3 nights a week to deep clean the walk-in cooler herself. Not because she couldn't pay someone to do it, but because being in that kitchen at midnight, alone with the hum of the refrigeration and the smell of the day's cooking still in the walls, it reminded her of why she had started. It reminded her that this was hers. Nobody's name on the lease but hers. Nobody's credit on the line but hers. She hired Deja as general manager 14 months after the divorce. Deja had run kitchens twice Ember's size, had managed a 100-seat restaurant in Buckhead for 6 years before the ownership group sold the building, and she found herself available. She came in for an interview, and within 20 minutes was telling Keisha everything that was wrong with the front-of-house flow. Keisha hired her on the spot. With Deja running operations, Keisha could think. She could sit with the numbers, look at the city, see what was missing. What was missing was a second location. The second Ember opened 18 months after the divorce was finalized. West Side Atlanta. A neighborhood that was changing, that was hungry for something rooted in what it had always been while being excellent enough for what it was becoming. Bigger than the original, 60 seats, a wine program, a private dining room that could hold 20 for events. Keisha had financed it herself. No cosigner. No partner. No one's name on the documents but hers. The bank had been cautious. 2 locations was a risk. Keisha had walked in with 4 years of Ember's financials, her profit margins highlighted, her vendor relationships documented, her team retention numbers in a separate column on a separate page. She got the loan. The first loan payment on the West Side location cleared the same month as the 41st payment on Terrence's failed lounge. She sat with those 2 numbers side by side one evening and felt something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not sadness. Something closer to determination. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The 3rd year after the divorce, Ember was profitable enough to be called something. Not just a restaurant, a presence. A place the city's food writers mentioned in lists. A place where the reservation wait list ran 3 weeks out on weekends. A place where the staff had been there long enough to know regulars by name and preference, where the sommelier, a woman named Tiana who Keisha had recruited from a hotel group downtown, was building a natural wine program that was starting to draw its own attention. The loan payments kept going out. Keisha kept working. She did not spend energy hating Terrence. Hate is expensive, and she was on a budget. She had seen what hate did to people. The way it kept them oriented toward the past, kept their face pointed backward at something that was already gone. She needed her face forward. What she did instead was pay attention, the way her grandmother had always told her to pay attention. Not to what people said, but to what the money was doing. What she eventually learned, through a series of connected events that began with a lawsuit she read about in public court records, was this. Terrence had not simply failed with the lounge. He had moved money. Capital that had come from the loan. Funds that were supposed to be operating capital for the business had been redirected. Some had gone into a consulting company. That company belonged to Simone. Simone had built her events consulting career on capital that came from a loan Keisha was still paying back, dollar by dollar, month by month. Keisha found this out on a quiet Tuesday morning while drinking her second cup of coffee at the kitchen table. She read the court filing twice. She set her mug down. She looked out the window at her backyard, at the garden she'd started 2 summers ago, because she needed something to grow that didn't require a full staff and a commercial kitchen to tend. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. 3 weeks, exactly, from the day she found it to the day of the Atlanta Culinary Summit. She sat with it carefully, the way you hold something fragile, not because you intend to keep it, but because you need to understand its full weight before you decide what to do with it. She called her friend Rochelle, who worked in Atlanta's event circuit and knew everyone who mattered in the hospitality world. Simone Garrett, Keisha said. The events coordinator. Terrence's girlfriend. What about her? Rochelle asked. She's been pitching herself as having access to serious investors. She's been telling people in the hospitality space that she has connections that can help restaurant owners get in front of money. Is that true? Rochelle was quiet for a moment. She's been saying that, yes. I don't know how real it is. She had 1 or 2 deals that went through but nothing major. She wants to be at the summit, Keisha said. She's been trying to get on the guest list. I heard that too. Put her on it, Keisha said. And Terrence too. Front section. Another pause. Keisha. I'm the keynote, Rochelle. It's my event. I want them there. Rochelle exhaled slowly. Okay, what are you doing? I'm giving them a front row seat to what their choices built, Keisha said. That's all. The Atlanta Culinary Summit happened every year at the Four Seasons in Midtown. 300 guests, restaurant owners, investors, food journalists, chefs, the people who shaped where Atlanta ate and why. Keisha had been invited to give the keynote address 6 months earlier. Her story had been selected as the summit's opening narrative. A Black woman from Decatur who had built a restaurant group from nothing, who had survived and thrived in an industry that did not make survival easy. She arrived at the hotel 2 hours early. She walked the ballroom, checked the staging, spoke with the event coordinator. She was wearing burgundy, not black, not safe. Something that meant she had arrived on her own terms and intended everyone to know it. She saw Terrence and Simone walk in at 5:45. They came through the main entrance together. Terrence in a new suit. Simone beside him with the bright, deliberate energy of a woman who has worked to be in a room like this and wants credit for it. They were moving through the crowd with purpose, looking for someone, scanning faces, performing the particular confidence of people who believe they're about to meet someone who can help them. Keisha watched them from across the room. She watched Simone's face when the realization arrived. The slight pause, the recalibration, the look she gave Terrence that said something she couldn't say out loud in a crowded ballroom. Terrence looked up. He found Keisha across the room. His expression did the math. She looked at him for exactly as long as she wanted to. Then she turned and walked toward the stage. The moderator gave the opening remarks. The room settled. The introduction was clean and warm. Ember, the expansion, the community work. When Keisha walked to the podium, 300 people looked at her, and she looked back at all of them. She didn't start with the success. That's not where the story started. She started at the kitchen table. 7 years ago, she said, I signed a loan document that wasn't mine to sign. The room was quiet immediately. The kind of quiet that happens when people recognize a truth they weren't expecting. I signed it because I believed in someone's vision. I signed it because I thought partnership meant shared risk. I signed it because I was in love, and love has a way of making legal documents feel like a formality. She looked out at the crowd. Journalists with notebooks. Investors leaning forward. Young chefs in the back rows who'd come to hear about success and were getting something more valuable. The anatomy of survival. That loan stayed in my name for 7 years. The business it funded failed. The marriage it was part of failed. But the loan did not fail. The loan was faithful. It showed up on the first of every month for $1,800 for 7 years. It didn't care about my feelings. It didn't care about what I'd been through. It just came every month, because that's what legal obligation does. She let that sit. I want to talk tonight about what you build when you're still paying for someone else's failure. Because that's the version of this story that nobody tells. We talk about the success, the second location, the wine program, the catering division, the team. We don't talk about what was happening simultaneously. The fact that every dollar Ember was generating, a portion was going to a debt I didn't create for a dream that wasn't mine. Terrence was in the third row. Keisha didn't look at him when she said the next part. She looked at the women in the room. There is a specific kind of financial abuse that has no name yet. It happens inside marriages. It happens when someone uses your creditworthiness to access capital and then removes themselves from the responsibility of paying it back. It leaves you holding a legal obligation while they move on, while they build new things, while they spend money that cost you everything. The room had gone very still. I paid off that loan last month. She let that land. 7 years. The final payment cleared on a Tuesday morning, and I went and made coffee, and I sat at my kitchen table in my house that I own, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. She paused. I felt what I should have felt when I opened Ember. I felt free. The applause started before she continued. She held up a hand. Gently, there was more. I'm telling you this because this room is full of people who are building something. And some of you are building with the wrong partners. Some of you have signed documents that are going to outlive the relationships that created them. Some of you are paying, right now, for someone else's dream while yours waits. She looked directly at a spot in the third row. Not at Terrence. Past him. Through him. I want you to know that what you build in that condition, what you build while you're still carrying someone else's debt, that is the most real thing you will ever build. Because you build it with nothing. You build it despite the weight. And when it stands for real. The keynote lasted another 30 minutes. She talked about Ember. She talked about the expansion. She talked about the team, 28 people now, all with benefits, all with living wages. She talked about the catering division, the wine program, the cookbook that was coming. She talked about the Decatur location she was about to sign a lease on, the neighborhood her grandmother had come from, the neighborhood where Viola Dupree had fed 300 people out of a kitchen with no sign on the door. When she finished, 300 people stood up. Keisha stepped off the stage. She accepted the congratulations of people she'd admired for years. She talked to 2 investors who wanted to discuss the Decatur expansion. She gave a quote to a journalist from a food publication that mattered. She did not speak to Terrence. What happened to Terrence happened in the spaces between. During the cocktail hour, a journalist who had been following the public court case involving the diverted lounge funds put the pieces together. The failed business, the co-signed loan, the transferred capital, the consulting company that had received those funds, the lawsuit that named the parties involved. The story moved through the room the way stories move in Atlanta, person to person in lowered voices, gathering weight at every stop. Someone would mention it. The person next to them pulled out a phone. The court filing was public record. The numbers were right there. By the end of the evening, the shape of what Terrence had done was visible to anyone paying attention, and in a room of 300 people who worked in food and hospitality and investment, everyone was paying attention. 2 women found Keisha at the cocktail tables between the keynote and the awards portion. They didn't come with drama. They came with recognition. Both of them had been through versions of the same thing. Business loans with partners who disappeared. Financial obligations that outlived the relationships that created them. They stood together for a few minutes and didn't say much, because there was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold. An investor who'd been in conversation about the Decatur expansion deal shook her hand and said, "Let's move faster on the lease." Rochelle found her near the bar and squeezed her arm without saying anything. A food journalist she'd known for years asked if she'd be willing to do a longer interview. Not about the restaurant specifically, but about the financial structures that trap women in business. About co-signing. About what happens when your credit is used as someone else's tool. Keisha said yes. Terrence left the summit while the awards were still being announced. He moved quickly, the way people move when they understand that the room has changed its mind about them and they want to be gone before anyone makes it official. Simone was not beside him when he left. Simone was still in her seat, phone in hand, working through something. She left 20 minutes after him. Alone. What Keisha heard later, through Deja, who heard it through the Atlanta hospitality world's very reliable network, was that Simone had spent that night on the phone with a lawyer. That the money in her consulting company, the capital that had funded her startup years, had been traced back to funds Terrence had moved out of the lounge's operating account before it closed. That the financial foundation he had given her so confidently, so generously, the investment that had felt like love and partnership and a future, had never been his to give. He had built her business on Keisha's money. On capital Keisha was still paying back at the time. On dollars that left Keisha's account every month for years while Simone's career was running on them. Simone had been built on Keisha's foundation. She had simply never been told. The lawyer explained her exposure. Potentially liable for received funds tied to fraud allegations. Business assets under scrutiny. The consulting company she'd spent 3 years building could be subject to recovery proceedings if the case moved forward. Keisha didn't feel satisfaction when she heard this. Satisfaction requires you to have been waiting for something, and Keisha had stopped waiting years ago. What she felt was something quieter, the feeling of a chapter reaching its final sentence. The particular exhale that comes when a long story finally arrives where it was always going. She received a letter from Simone 2 weeks later, forwarded through Rochelle. It was written in careful language, the language of someone who has had time alone and a lawyer and has decided to say something real. Simone said she had dissolved the consulting business. She said she was leaving Terrence. She said understanding where the money had come from changed every assumption she'd built her last 3 years on. She said she was sorry, not as a request, not as an opening for a conversation, just as a fact she needed to state out loud to someone. Keisha read it once, set it on her kitchen table, looked at the backyard garden through the window for a moment. Then she went to work. The Decatur opening was 3 weeks away. There was a menu to finalize, a staff orientation to run, a produce order to review, a private dining room to name. The letter would be there when she got back. Simone would have to do what Keisha had done, find the floor, stand on it, build from there. That was the only way through anything. Keisha knew it from experience. 84 months of experience, to be exact. Completion. The Decatur location opened on a Thursday. Always a Thursday, Keisha's lucky day, the day she'd met her first investor, the day Ember had first turned a profit, the day the final loan payment had cleared. The space was larger than anything she'd done before, with a rooftop garden where they grew herbs and lettuces for the kitchen, and a private dining room she'd named Viola. On opening night, her grandmother sat at the chef's table and ate every course without saying a word. At the end, she reached across and took Keisha's hand. "You built this," Viola said. "Yes, ma'am." "With your own name on it?" "Yes, ma'am." Viola looked around the room. The warm lighting, the full tables, the kitchen visible through the pass, her great-grandmother's cast iron pan mounted on the wall as decoration and reminder. "Your grandfather tried to talk me out of the catering business," Viola said. "Told me it wasn't practical. Told me I needed to focus on the house." Keisha smiled. She'd heard pieces of this story, but never the whole thing. "I kept cooking," Viola said simply. "I kept feeding people. I kept showing up to kitchens that people told me weren't mine to be in." She squeezed Keisha's hand. "The kitchen is always yours if you're willing to stand in it long enough." Outside, Decatur moved through its Thursday evening. People heading to dinner, heading home, heading toward whatever the night held. Inside Ember Decatur, every table was full. The kitchen was firing. The sommelier was mid-explanation of a natural wine from a small Georgia vineyard. Keisha stood at the pass for a moment, watching the plates go out. 28 employees. 2 thriving locations. A third that was already booked out 2 months. A cookbook coming in the spring. A catering division that had just signed its largest corporate contract. And a loan, fully paid, finally done, that had tried to be her ceiling and had become, instead, her foundation. She had signed those papers 7 years ago, believing in someone else. She had paid for that belief every first of the month for 84 months. She had done it without collapsing, without stopping, without asking anyone to carry the weight with her. And when she finally set it down, she was already standing inside everything she had built while carrying it. They called her a success story. She knew the full title. She was a woman who had been handed someone else's failure, put her name on it, paid every cent of it back, and built an empire anyway. That was the story. That was always going to be the story.